Welcome once again, everyone, to one of our special podcast series here at the American Mind, The Stakes, where Michael Anton and assorted guests talk about our current regime crisis. This is Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. Today we have another discussion between Michael and Charles Haywood, friend of Claremont, editor of The Worthy House, a mostly book review site that Charles has run for many years after getting kicked off of Amazon for writing too many right-wing reviews on Amazon. It's another, a breezy but serious conversation. They talk about ancient political history, philosophy, the current state of American race relations, critical race theory, the modern left, and they end with a bit of a discussion about the coming trials of our current financial situation, the endless money printing, whether or not to go into Bitcoin, but that's all very brief. Anyway, it's another lively conversation. People seem to respond well to this new series hosted by Mike, so we're going to continue it. And Charles is a very smart man, an industrialist, an entrepreneur in his own right, and has interesting views on a wide variety of topics. So we hope you enjoy it. Thanks for listening.
All right. Well, thank you, Ryan, once again. And we are back by, I don't know how much popular demand, but at least some popular demand. People seem to enjoy the last outing between Charles and myself. So here we are again. I am Michael Anton, and my guest or colleague, as we want to say, is Charles Haywood, the author of The Worthy House, a serious online blog review. I introduced it last time, I think with more fanfare, so I'm not going to go into detail this time. Those of you who listened last time will remember. Those of you who didn't listen to the last one should just go and hear it. We talked about, we were theoretical, I would say, the last time, pretty high level. We probably will get a theoretical and high level again, but we also want to see if we can stay topical. The one problem we do have with staying topical is, in order to preserve what's left of my mental health, I tend not to pay that much attention to the news. So I often don't know what's going on. And when I don't know what's going on, my blood pressure levels lower, my mood elevates, and everything works out better. So I'm willing to be confronted with news occasionally as necessity intervenes, but I don't seek it. However, I assume that Charles is a lot better informed than I am. And so
I may be better informed, but I do think that there's a lot to be said for not paying attention to the ticky-tack of the news. And I think you were joking on the main Claremont podcast a couple of weeks ago that you had given the other Claremont people permission to murder you if you ever showed up on Twitter. Which I think is a sound approach. I occasionally show up on Twitter, but not to interact, mostly just to
no, I don't even have a Pierre Delecto secret account. I'm completely off of it. I'm on several chats with various people, and I do get Twitter links sent to me. And when a friend sends me a link, I typically assume that there's some value in clicking on it and looking at it, and so I click on it and I look at it. But other than that, I'm not a Twitter surfer.
Well, it is true, as everybody knows, that Twitter and social media in general is designed by smart people to suck you in and raise your blood pressure. So I think you're approaching it right. Moreover, we're a history group here, right? I think that we don't want to talk a bunch about current events other than as they bear on larger issues, largely philosophical issues, political philosophy issues, because plenty of other people are having hot takes on whatever is happening now. So I think we can. I will say that our last episode, from my perspective, was wildly popular. I got a lot of people reaching out to me. They were very excited to see you out in public, and they were secondarily excited to see me out in public. So that was a win for everybody. As I like to tell my wife, the people, they demand the Worthy House. So hopefully that will continue with this next go around.
Good. All right. Well, where should we start then?
I have two follow-ups.
Okay.
One from my mother and one from a friend of mine. So I wanted to run those by you, if that would be a good place to start.
Okay, I will start with actually one very slightly topical thing. It shows you how I get my news these days. A friend sends me on Signal, boy, New York is really, send some snarky comment about New York. I have no idea what he's talking about. I taught my class last night. I came home. I watched a little TV. I went to bed. What happened? He said that basically there was like a mini riot in the Diamond District of Manhattan, which is 47th between 5th and 6th, where some anti-Israeli protesters were like driving down the street or blaring things, and there's fights, and of course this is now being the new New York. Nobody does anything about it. And I thought, I said to him sort of mordantly, "Don't worry, de Blasio is on top of it." I mean, as we all know full well, like de Blasio is on top of absolutely nothing. His feet are probably not even on top of the city streets. That's how completely out of touch with everything de Blasio is. But it's troublesome that, I mean, more than troublesome, but I mean, look at how far that city fell in such a short amount of time. I mean, street crime had gotten to the point where you just didn't think about it anymore. Probably 15 years ago, and certainly by as short as 1 year ago, you felt almost inviolable in all but the sketchiest neighborhoods of New York City. Now we're talking about a midtown block in the heart of the business district that can have this kind of essentially street brawling, third world mayhem happening. And is this our new normal? In any event, it's very depressing. And by the way, street protests have been pretty common. I've seen lots of them in New York. That is to say, when you have every conceivable nationality, ethnic group, and whatever, plus you have consulates to the United Nations dotted all over the city. Everybody who's angry at this country or that country likes to go to the consulate and set up and carry signs and march around. And the NYPD used to be extremely good at regulating those, and they never got out of hand. And now this one, I'm probably, some people are listening to me now and their blood pressure is going up and they're thinking he's being very neutral about this, as if it was just sort of jets and sharks, nobody's really guilty, and they just happen to meet in a block and have a rumble. No, I know what happened. I mean, I'm not that dumb or naive. My topic here, though, is more the fact that the city has lost both the ability and the will to do anything to control this kind of thing.
Well, civilizational success and civilizational order is always a fragile veneer, particularly when you have a overly diverse group of people within your civilization, because whatever Dan Quayle may have said, actually, I think it was Bill Kristol, said back in 1990 when that phrase was coined, diversity is not our strength. And so you can have a successful civilization with diverse elements, but only with some degree of commonality and control. And we have, as you say, the opposite from our ruling class. Didn't de Blasio get in trouble a couple of years ago for flying off to some private island in the Caribbean in the middle of some New York disaster? I can't remember the details, but that sounds like the kind of thing he would do. And that's the kind of thing he does. He's Pontius Pilate. He washes his hands of these things and attempts to maintain his own political power.
You could be confusing any number of things. I mean, does de Blasio going to Jeffrey Epstein's island? I don't know. I know.
Maybe. I think
Bloomberg famously has a place in Bermuda where he liked to go, and with a private jet and a $50 billion fortune, he could just fly there whenever he wants. And he often would tick off the reporters is that he didn't tell them when he was going. So sometimes he would just be gone from the city for 2 or 3 days, and no one would know where he was.
Maybe I'm thinking about Bloomberg. That sounds actually right. But I'm sure that if I dug hard enough, de Blasio has done some other thing that makes him Pontius Pilate-like. So I'm going to.
Look, de Blasio is I think well past. It's no longer a debate. Is he the worst mayor in the history of New York? He handily beats David Dinkins and John Lindsay as the worst mayor in the history of the city. I think, which is something. To be number one at anything is to be special.
Have you ever read the William F. Buckley book about his run for mayor?
Yes.
Which I have not. I have not read the book.
It's hilarious. It's his best book, I think. Actually, a lot of his books are kind of forgettable. Not that I've read them all, but
you've forgotten them before.
That's like those spy novels. I mean, if you read one, you've read them all, and I just took a look at them and I thought, There's more political, more serious books, but The Unmaking of a Mayor is actually extremely entertaining.
Okay, well, I'll dig it out, and one of these days I'm going to go down to Florida later this summer for a vacation. Maybe I'll bring it along. So interesting. Well, I don't really have any other comment on New York other than everything's in the crapper in terms of, I think, big cities. And part of that is this excessive diversity, but a large part of it is simply abdication of the political elites, and in particular, abdication of the law enforcement and judicial functions in favor of political action. And so you don't see that, for example, in the Midwest, outside of Chicago. You see this much less simply because the local prosecutors and so on, even in the larger cities, are less likely to simply give everybody a pass for bad behavior. So it's like anything, like with children. You get more of what you encourage or fail to punish. And so I don't think it's necessarily a symptom of our society as a whole, not that I'm Mr. Optimist about our society as a whole, I think most of this stuff is confined to our larger cities and the places that are wholly dominated by the left. I don't think it's going to spread beyond that, at least this narrow kind of street violence. I could be wrong.
Further undercutting my claim to complete news ignorance, I was able, somehow the news that the mayor of Chicago said she will only speak to reporters of color managed to penetrate my shields and reach me somehow. So I did see that. And I see that she's actually getting a little bit of blowback from that. Not enough to cause her to back down or anything, but at least it's good to see people stand up and go, okay, we're taking this too far. Although or maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I had a debate the other day with a friend who said, did you see what happened after Biden's speech to Congress, and then Tim Scott says this is not a racist country? Now, that's not to praise Tim Scott too much. I basically do agree he's a conventional Republican. He's not going to save us, and he's got a lot of problems. But what was interesting is that just him saying this is not a racist country, it put Biden and then Harris on enough of a back foot defensive footing that they had to agree with it. And and first of all, that's not what they've been saying for the last 12 months. And deep in her heart, that's not what Kamala Harris believes either. They must have felt that they had to do it. And I had very mixed emotions about that, in that, if they're really going to back down and moderate this, part of me fears, well, maybe that means they can stay in power longer, that they're learning lessons about how to control themselves a little bit for the sake of the greater good. That is to say, their greater good, not our greater good. Because I had expected they'd get into the driver's seat of the car and just mash the pedal down, which is basically what they're doing. But I wonder if these aren't early signs that maybe the wokeness is being carried too far, and some of the people running it see that and want to back off a little bit. Doesn't mean they can control their followers necessarily. I tend to think they can't. But in my more accelerationist moments, which I admit I have occasionally, I don't want to see that happen. I want to see them just bet it all, put it all right in the middle of the table and lose.
I think there's a lot of conflicting threads, and I agree that it seems like they're pushing the pedal to the floor, and in many cases, nothing's happening. By the same token, let's take Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago. Yeah, sure, some people complain that she is engaging in something that's clearly unconstitutional and probably illegal under some federal statute or other. And she hasn't apologized. She hasn't changed her mind. Some people complained and she ignored them. And so until she's punished for her actions, and this is a general principle, until our enemies are punished and feel hurt, harm, and pain for what they do, they may not push the pedal as hard, but they keep pushing it.
Good point.
It needs to go in reverse at twice the speed. It's, for the next 30 years, it needs to go in reverse at twice the speed it's gone in the wrong direction for 30 years, or else it's just slowing down the decline. So
and you and I can be pretty confident that it's definitely not going to go in reverse at twice the speed of less. So
therefore, it's going to go in reverse, just not under their drivership.
Right.
So I am somewhat surprised that not more truly dreadful things have happened since January. But the year is young. We'll find out.
Yeah.
So let me take you back a couple thousand years.
Okay.
Put on your Greek philosophy hat again, and your history hat, which is your professor hat. Let's put it that way. So my mother asked me this question, and I said, I will bring this up to Professor Anton in our next podcast, which is, we talked a lot about the cycle of regimes. And so most of the examples that people use for the cycle of regimes are tied to the classical world, and in particular to Greek city-states.
Yeah.
Is it really true that the cycle of regimes is as universal as we sometimes like to think it is, particularly given the example of medieval and early, middle, late medieval Europe, where monarchy was the default? And yes, you had a certain amount of push and pull among the aristocratic and monarchic elements, but generally speaking, you had more or less stable monarchies in many areas for a very long period of time. And you never had any kind of democratic element in any meaningful way coming to the fore. So that would suggest, I was kind of thinking of other Western examples. I can't think of any AD prominent examples of the cycle of regimes really at all, at least in their classical Polybius type sense. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I have a couple answers to that. One is, Well, I'll take the second part first, which is, can you think of any examples? The one that really sticks out for me is Florence, is medieval Florence, which does cycle through, it goes back and forth through several cycles of republicanism, for princely government, and so on. And sometimes the republicanism is more aristocratic, sometimes it's less aristocratic, sometimes the princes are, pseudo-legitimate under the Holy Roman Empire. Sometimes they're the Medici when they're clearly, tyrants. That is to say, not evil governors, but usurpers, civil principates, as Machiavelli would call it in Prince Chapter 7. Overall, though, the point is right in that there's a change between the ancient and medieval world. There's more than one change that makes the cycle, I would say, not necessarily go away, but it blunts the edges of it. And there are two related changes. One is the Roman conquest of the ancient world, which means there aren't any separate regimes for a long time in the classical world. There's just one regime for hundreds of years. And when it breaks up, it's not conducive to the reconstitution of republican small r regimes. It breaks up in such a way that everybody, in a sense, the macro cycle restarts, where Aristotle predicts that most regimes begin as kingship. Begin as sort of or tribal chieftains that grow into kingship, and we revert back to, in a sense, for what the classics would consider to be an earlier stage of political development. Now, the classics are not progressives in the sense that they think that history has a direction and a culmination, but they do think that a mixed regime with democratic, aristocratic, and monarchical elements is a stage of development that is more advanced in the sense of more sophisticated and better, just simply better. And it can only come after some portion of the, some frame of development. The reason why I would say they're not historicists or progressives in that sense is they don't believe that once you achieve it, you've locked in forever, or it just keeps improving. It will, once achieved, eventually decay and decline, and the cycle will restart. Anyway, the conquest of the ancient world and the rise of a completely new universalist faith. So there's an extent to which the original idea of the cycle of regimes is dependent upon each regime having its own separate gods. And that is to say, in a Europe in which the pagan gods have been replaced by the one God, in which pagan faith, pagan rituals have been replaced by one set of rituals, and by an authoritative church that transcends every conceivable regime, that's much more in a way conducive to facilitative of monarchy than paganism was. And so Christianity, Machiavelli makes this case. I mean, Christianity in a sense is a check against, at least it's not a ironclad, but it certainly is, I was going to say it prevents the emergence of monarchy. That's too strong. Prevent is too strong, but it holds it back or slows it down, the emergence of republicanism, I should say, not monarchy, right? Christianity, in all of its ways, both spiritually, institutionally, is conducive to monarchical government in a way that paganism was less so and more conducive to republicanism. And so this is one of the reasons you see republicanism eclipse in the modern world. Now, if we think of the cycle world regimes more or less strictly in the Polybian sense and more kind of in a macro sense of birth, growth, maturity, decline, decay, right? I think we can see several examples in the modern world of regimes or civilizations that come into being, thrive, and decline. Most of the regimes of the civilizations in Western Europe have done so. I mean, no one would go to England today and look at England in 2020 and think it's as healthy as it was in 1880. The English, in a way, go through something like the macro cycle, thriving under monarchy in its absolute terms becoming odious, and its power chipped away, and more of them distributed among the people, first among elites and then among the people more broadly, comes into a period of great thriving. I mean, England's zenith as a world power is sometime in the second half of the 19th century, first quarter or maybe first eighth of the 20th century, and a fairly long, slow decline. I think we could say much the same about what happened in France. We could say much the same about sort of the arc of Western Europe as a whole. And if you look specifically at the United States, the history of the United States tracks so exactly. I mean, the stages, that is to say, not every event is the same, not the duration is not the same. But if you compare the history of the U.S. with Rome, it's amazing how closely it tracks, right? Founded by kings, long period of stability and growth, under the kings until the kings become odious and are rejected and thrown out. The formation of the early republic is highly aristocratic, but the people as the regime continues to grow and thrive, the people demand more and more of a share and chip away at these aristocratic privileges. Demand, in our case, it's the franchise among other things. It's just lessen property requirements. People, more people should be allowed to vote. We should have more power. That democratization leads to some measure of success, but also some measure of decadence. And if we're tracking this classically, we would say that the U.S. is in the if we're making the direct comparison to Rome, we're sometime in the very late republic at this moment, right? There's still a republic. We know it's kind of a farce. The same way anybody who could really see, ahead in the early 1st century BC, they knew that like when the fighting between Marius and Sulla and things like that was not the sign of a healthy republic. This isn't going to last, but it wasn't yet formally over. So I'm one of those who says if we're going to take the parallel very strictly, we would have to say it's not yet formally over for the United States as a republic, even though somebody like you would say it's over. But you'd have to admit, wouldn't you, that it's not, as long as we're having elections every 4 years and there's some chance that there'll be a change in power, it's not yet formally over.
It's not
even though the chance
over.
of reversal is basically nil.
Zombies appear to have the appearance of life, and so it's not formally over until you shoot the zombie through the face. So that's just the event we're waiting for. I agree with that about obviously the birth, life, and death of civilizations, and the final stage prior to death is decay. That's inevitable. It, to me, is somewhat different from the cycle of regimes, which implies that there is a procession from a centralized, individualized government to a broader type of aristocratic government to some type of republicanism or democracy. I guess my point is that it seems to be at least possible that monarchy, especially as you say, under a universal religion, which we don't have anymore, but leaving that part aside, if one has a universal religion, monarchy with some elements of mixed government, a strong aristocracy, a strong set of customary law and other things that can place limits on the natural tendency of a monarch to behave badly, can be a very stable long-term political arrangement, totally aside from the underlying cycle of decay within that civilization, which is inevitable regardless of how you set it up. So while it is true that Florence had a long history of Republican type government back and forth to monarchical type government, I'm not sure that Italian city-states are the best example simply because of their small size. For example, I saw the other day, Nate Fisher, who's this guy I follow on Twitter, was remarking that at the height of its power, I can't remember the exact decade, but when all the most famous people in Florence that we still talk about now, Michelangelo and what have you, were alive, Florence had a population of 80,000 people. So, I mean, that's a very small as far as even historical civilizations go. And so I don't think that you can point necessarily to a cycle that
about the same size as a classical city. Maybe
right.
A little,
so I think
which is what the theory was predicted around.
Yeah, so we I think focusing on the cycle for larger scale entities is probably a mistake, and we should focus on the decay for us. And with the assumption that it's entirely possible, and we're coming back to some of the stuff we talked about last time, that a limited monarchical system actually is long-term stable, rather than one that tends towards republicanism, and that the decay of the West was in part caused not by the natural decay of civilizations, but by external drive-by shooting, by the adoption of unfortunate political ideologies, ultimately rooted in the bad parts of the Enlightenment. Which gives me, my point is that I think there's some hope for a future society that is stable and makes sense, rather than having constant churn like the cycle of regimes tends to imply.
Okay. I think if the classics could respond, they would say, well, nothing's going to last forever, but a challenge for the political philosopher. Or Strauss sometimes puts it this way: if the political philosopher can actually be involved, like he's asked for his advice, he would say, try to make the thing last as long as you can, because stability is good and longevity is good, knowing that it's not going to last forever. all things being equal, probably a monarchy is going to, all things otherwise equal, a monarchy is probably going to last longer than a republic, I think, for the classics. The exceptions would be, the great exception is Switzerland or something like that, where it's A, it's reasonably small, and B, its situation is just perfectly set up to not be subject to outside interference, but also not be tempted itself to expand or get involved in other people's stuff. So 500 years of war, chaos, and conflict, and the Swiss essentially send out mercenaries if they do anything at all. Otherwise, don't get involved.
The Swiss are decaying rapidly now too. It doesn't get a lot of press, but the Swiss are.
Yeah, I've seen that.
The people around them.
I've seen that, but I mean, to me, this just points to when, and sometimes in this context, people will ask or will discuss, well, what uniquely went wrong in America? Well, I'm sure there are many things that uniquely went wrong in America, but the fact that the whole West seems to be slitting its collective wrists all at the same time suggests that this is something very, very, very macro. So in addition to the cycle of regimes, there's the cycle of sects or civilizational arcs, and we could be unfortunate enough to be alive at a time when the whole civilizational arc is just hitting a trough and it'll have to restart. I think that's possible. It may be even the most plausible explanation for where we are at the moment. The problem, though, I think with the stability point, Machiavelli puts it very well in Discourse. Aristotle and Machiavelli both discuss this, which is, can you set something up that will be sort of perfectly content with itself, doesn't threaten its neighbors, doesn't tempt its neighbors, doesn't decay internally, and is essentially perpetual? And they both come up with the answer, probably not. Aristotle seems more sanguine about it than Machiavelli does, because Machiavelli stacks the deck in his argument. He wants the reader to take away the lesson that it's better to try to expand than to try to. He tries to foreclose the possibility of this long-term stasis. I think what they all would say, though, is that the problem is, if your hypothetical monarchy that you just posed is doing well, its own success will eventually cause it problems in at least one of two ways, and probably in both ways. One is success leads to success breeds success. It leads to affluence. It leads to comfort. It leads to innovation and all kinds of things that eventually, over time, erode the ancestral way of life. The other problem is, too, that Republican pressure, that small r Republican pressure that we're talking about, is likely, if not inevitably, is likely to grow if and as the common people, the ordinary citizen, gains more and more wealth and affluence and comes to resent the fact that he has really no say over his own fate, or very little say, right? And they start demanding a share. I mean, I had to reread a lot of Aristotle's Politics for a class I'm teaching right now. And to the extent that Aristotle's clear on anything, I mean, he's actually a fairly cagey, coy writer. He thinks that this is to some extent inevitable. There's always going to be a basic class conflict between, in his term, there's really only Democrats and oligarchs, right? The Democrats, they don't claim the same share or the same types of honors as the oligarchs, but they will claim some part of it. And even in an extremely stable, well-governed, successful monarchy, the Democrats will, you'll get your Magna Carta moment. Now, granted, the Magna Carta was a bunch of nobles going after the king and not the commons, but they will claim their share, some share in the state's honors and a sense of self-government, and they will claim that the more as the richer they get. So, and the success feeds the turmoil in terms of decadence and all that, but also in a way feeding the egos of common people who go, I'm not content to live like this anymore. And so how do you find that absolute sweet spot? Now, let me give you an example, again, from classical philosophy, a book I like to teach a lot, Xenophon's Cyropaedia. So as the book begins, we are taken to, quote unquote, Persia, except it's not Persia, it's made up, right? It's a made up Greek city-state that Xenophon calls Persia for his own reasons, which I won't get into now. It looks like it's his version of the classical best regime. So it's Xenophon's version of Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Polity or Socrates' City and Speech or whatever you want to call it. It's much simpler to understand, though. And he doesn't say how long this Persia has been around, but he suddenly shifts to the present tense in the sections in which he talks about it and gives it this sort of air of timelessness. And it seems like this Persia is something like what you say. It's just been there forever. It could go on forever. And how does it operate? Well, there's peers and there's commoners, and it's a monarchy, except the monarch doesn't really have power. He's a ceremonial figurehead type who presides over the sacrifices and kind of can open he's very much like Queen Elizabeth in a sense. It's really run by this council of elders who have done a great job. As far as you can tell from reading this, you don't even know when the Persia started, and you don't know when it would end if the main character Cyrus, doesn't come along and convince a handful of them to change the regime, and before the book is over, it's all completely done. I think one of the lessons Xenophon is trying to get across with that is, look how easy it was for Cyrus to tempt these guys to abandon their ancestral customs, which have worked out for them for, 500 years, whatever it's been. They walked away in a heartbeat. Why? Because he promises them more stuff, more honor, more rule over their neighbors, more glory, more material wealth. The real problem that you have with any regime such as that you're talking about is, you and I, as whatever we are, political pseudo-philosophers, can recognize the value in restraint, in saying no, in self-restraint. Like, I realize that my virtue could make me $1 million a year if I put it into making money, but I'm not going to do that because virtue is more valuable for its own sake, and it's better to perpetuate. Like, I'd rather have Persia be stable, happy, and kind of middle class forever, rather than take all of this accumulated social capital that we've built up and go out and conquer the world and kick butt and spend it and be glorious. All right, you and I both know that's a great outcome, but human nature is such that people want that second outcome. It's like, if have you ever heard the old phrase, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? Essentially what Cyrus says to the Persians is, if we're as great as we think we are, why are we sitting around here in this relatively poor city-state? We could use this accumulated, he doesn't use this kind of language, obviously, but this accumulated social capital to go out and kick butt and rule our enemies and get rich. Why don't we do that? It's like we've been training for a match for 500 years and we never go into the ring and fight.
I'll disagree with that to a certain extent, or rather place a different emphasis on it. I don't think the kind of static or semi-static, happy middle-class type of entity has any long-term capacity, partially for the reasons that you identified, but also simply because it's stagnant. And so I would weight the desirable situation, closer to what you just described somewhat negatively, desire to go out and kick butt. But kicking butt is in Cyrus's case, is go out and conquer surrounding lands. I think that's not necessarily what is necessary for people to succeed or for a society to succeed, but you have to have some binding outward-facing goal to have a truly successful society. And I think frequently people will dodge that by saying, well, eventually that society will decay, no matter how successful it is. And that's true. I mean, obviously it'll decay, and they'll probably decay for the reasons that you outlined, which is that there'll be too much affluence. And I don't think that necessarily means that the common people will demand a role in governance, but certainly the common people have to have a role in that a participation in that affluence. But for example, the classic example of a long-term successful entity of this type that did not involve lots of common participation in political activity is Venice, which did have a very outbound, though commercially focused rather than conquering focused, set of tasks or goals that it set for itself civilizationally. And yes, eventually decayed until Napoleon finally took it out back and shot it in the head. But it was very successful for a very long time. So I think from our perspective, part of what is necessary is not to convince the common people why it is that they need to abase themselves before some new monarchy. I think you have to, particularly nowadays with modern communications and so on, offer the common people a good deal as part of your renewed civilization. But the key thing is getting rid of ideologies that are pernicious. I'm not saying that democracy per se is a pernicious ideology, but certainly the modern mass ideologies centered around core leftist beliefs of emancipation and forced egalitarianism are always going to ruin a society if you have mass participation in governance. And so if you reduce that mass participation and offer a good deal, we call it a square deal, for the common people, as well as the opportunity for the most talented and so on to rise within the ranks of society and achieve those honors in prestige and other things that are associated with people who are at the top rank of society, you have at least the potential for having a long-term, stable yet expanding society. Potential, no more.
I mean, the Chinese, in a way, are testing this, right? We promise you nothing in terms of political participation, but we will raise your standard of living. And we will give you the satisfaction of knowing that you are participating in what will shortly be, at least if the Chinese regime gets its way, the world's greatest great power. And we know people get a satisfaction from being part of a great power. In that, if you read anything about Britain in the 19th century, the poor really didn't start to get a decent deal until well into the 20th century. And yet everybody took pride in the fact that they had the world's greatest empire and were the world's leading great power. So there's a lot of psychological satisfaction from that, even if you're getting the shaft on the material end. So if the Chinese can do both of those things, maybe they can have the kind of regime that you're talking about and make it last well. I think it matters that there's no tradition of liberty in China, but this will also test, in a sense, it will test this historical question that a lot of I'm not sure you and I buy it, right? But a more typical neoliberal political scientist type would say, no, we're too far into history now for the Chinese people to be treated like they have no legitimate right to have any control over their government at all, and they're eventually going to demand their rights.
Well, we'll find out. I think as to the English experience, that's certainly true about the industrialized poor, but the agricultural poor prior to the Industrial Revolution actually had in England a pretty good deal. And it was the early industrialization, that caused a lot of problems for the industrialized poor, and as well created the disparities that made the poor, the agricultural poor, who were by no means rich, but were at least potentially more dissatisfied. But I think as far as China goes, I think the analysis is right. But the acid test, and the thing that I think far too many people ignore, and we touched on briefly last time, is will people have children? And the returns on that are not good. You cannot run a civilization where people aren't having children, and more children than are necessary for simple replacement, much less far fewer children than are necessary for replacement. Because having children is two things. It's a vote of confidence in the future, and it's a willingness of the people as a whole to subordinate their kind of immediate gratification and autonomic individualism for the constraints that having children impose, and both individually, the constraints are individually, but you do those things for yourself, but also for larger society. And there's no indication that any modern society is meeting that challenge.
No, that's to me an interesting question to which I do not know the answer. We know that China ran that experiment, or whatever you want to call it, the one-child policy, for about 30 years. And we also know that every industrialized society, especially information age economy, basically when a country gets rich beyond a point X, and a lot of social science has been done to figure out exactly what that point X is, but we see this trend all over the place. It's not merely a Western trend. It's true in Singapore. It's true in theocratic Iran. It's true all over the world. Birth rates go down. So is the Chinese experience they're just following the same script that everybody else follows? Or is it compounded by decades of the one China policy? Or is it both? It's probably both. It certainly is at least some of the former, because I hear stories from younger people I know who are in business, who travel a lot, and they say, going to a major Chinese city now is just like being in New York in 2000. It's the young people are all the same. They're not thinking about marriage. They're partying. They're going to bars every night. They're spending their disposable income on shoes and handbags. They're really proud of their 600 square foot condo with the chic furniture and this and that. And if I were to be even a little bit blunter, like, the girls are not interested in marriage, or if they are, like, to have any kind of a shot, a guy has to be, the average guy, even average successful guy in the city is just considered kind of beneath consideration. You need to be, really extraordinary in a lot of ways. And the compounded effects of the one-child policy was many years of sex selection abortion, which has skewed the sex ratio in the country.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is. In nature, it's supposed to be 105 to 100, male to female. In China, it's higher. I was going to say it's 125 to 100. That's probably high. It's probably not that high. I mean, that's so extraordinarily high, but it's much above what it would otherwise be because of the effects of the one-child policy, which of course means as long as there's the more scarcity on the one side and abundance on the other side it means that the scarce side can afford to be as picky as it damn well wants. And it just further slows everything down in terms of marriage and child bearing.
I think that's right. I mean, and it definitely is, in my opinion, which is knowing nothing about China, but knowing a fair bit about human nature, both of those things, both the one-child policy and the focus on affluence and individualism. But the Chinese have had a lot of success, as you say, in potentially building a type of civilization that may last and not be subject to some of the decay that we're talking about and witnessing here. But there's no evidence, despite increasingly frantic attempts, that they have made any progress on reversing this problem. And almost certainly the underlying thing that has to be changed for this to reverse is a restoration of, say, pre-1950 or pre-1940s type sex roles, where what you have now, where women are educated as much as men, because women want to marry men who are richer and more educated than them. You have less and less marriage. You have women who work and in order to get material goods and consumerism, and they don't have children as a result, because who really wants to work a 60-hour-a-week job and have 4 children? And there's no, worst of all, there's a social stigma to having lots of children rather than social prestige to having lots of children. And government, no matter how successful, can't by fiat dictate what actions have social prestige or social stigma. It can make certain attempts. I mean, both the Russians and the Hungarians, the Russians most dramatically, have had some attempts with some limited success to bring back prestige to child rearing. But at the end of the day, if men and women are both expected to get advanced degrees and work in the workplace at the higher end of society, and the lower end of societies aren't expected to get married at all, then you're just never going to solve this problem. And no civilization, no matter how structured, is ever going to be successful. And we're all going to end up with 500 million people on planet Earth eating, fruit off trees or something. It's going to be terrible. We'll be dead, so it won't be our problem. But it's really just not a very pleasant thought.
Well, correct me. You know more about it than I do, but I thought the Hungarians had been reasonably successful at getting birth rates up through government incentives and changing.
A little bit. So I mean, for our listenership, is that a word?
Yeah.
So I'm half Hungarian, and I kind of speak Hungarian, and spent a bunch of time in Hungary. So they've had limited success, modest success. The birth rate is still far below replacement. And one thing that is invisible to most outsiders is that there is internal tension in Hungary with respect to the Gypsy population, what is more PC called the Roma population. And so a lot of the Hungarian birth things, such as birth incentives, such as reducing income tax for women with more than 3 children, are actually designed to depress the Gypsy birth rate and increase the non-Gypsy birth rate. So you have to parse that out when you analyze the Hungarian birth rates. But even if you don't parse it out, the success has been limited so far, and the attitude of Hungarian youth isn't all that much different on average than the Chinese attitude you described. Yes, they may vote for Orban because they may reject certain elements of the Western European decadence and so on, but rarely they're not willing to do the things collectively as a whole, take the reduction in material standards, take the reduction in their ability to jet off to Ibiza or whatever young Hungarian people do, that having more children requires. And there's limited social prestige, except in very limited social circles. I mean, it doesn't help in America that the Amish have social prestige for people who have a lot of children. It does help the Amish grow rapidly. I saw some statistic the other day that whatever it was, that in 100 years, America will be 98% Amish given current birth rates. But it doesn't help that subgroups, or especially ones that are bound by particular religious beliefs, are doing well at having lots of children. You need to have society as a whole, including secular people, invested in having more children, or your society is always going to head directly into the trash can. I know that I sound worked up about this, but I think it's probably the most crucial and least discussed topic that is relevant to future civilizational success. In fact, much more important in some ways than whether we have a monarchy or an aristocracy or some form of renewed republican government. I mean, yeah, we need to get rid of the current one. Okay, fine. But this population question is crucial.
This won't make you feel much better because I'm still alone. But I did notice pretty anecdotally, and I think there's decent data to back it up, that at the upper income levels, really at the sort of the, I don't know that we have an upper class anymore, but at the upper income levels of the ruling class. So there's a certain, all the trends remain the same. You have to have a minimum college and usually an advanced degree and a career. You can't get married before age X, and then you start. But if people have enough money, they have more kids, and there was some prestige attached in New York, for instance, to having 3 or more. It really meant like you totally made it. You didn't need to be on the treadmill anymore, and your husband could, your husband being able to pay for your one income at that level in New York meant he's making $1 million a year or something like that. So that was a real sign that. And it was a sign that for a lot of women, even highly educated professional women, like they just didn't want to do that daily grind forever. They'd rather check, if they could afford to, they'd rather check out at a certain point. Now, even if that's true, we're still talking about a sliver of the population. It's not enough the numbers are not high enough to make up for the dearth that you're talking about. But the hopeful thing I might take from it is that it shows that that the stigma isn't as maybe as ironclad as we fear, right? That if the people who could choose anything at all that they wanted, eventually not only do they choose to do this, but they kind of flaunt it. I mean, it'd be kind of.
I agree. The stigma has reversed. I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a very clear stigma. If you had more than 2 children, you were a bad person. And I think that has, but I'm not sure that reversing, because it's a marker of financial success, is really the direction that we want to take it. That's not really portable down
you're right. The numbers are
scale by definition.
Then again, it's possible if since these people do set the tone, that if just their example-ism, having a lot of kids, it's not uncool. It's not a sign of knuckle dragging Neanderthal behavior. It's not going to kill the planet and that kind of thing. Maybe that trickles down, but then what we would need is we need to make a public policy that makes it easier for people further down the income stream. Or let's put it this way. It's not my phrase. I'm not even sure who coined it. It's been around for a while, but there came a point sometime in the 80s, 90s or beyond. I don't know exactly when children became luxury consumption items, right? That used to be the old days. A sign of poverty is you had a big family because you put your kids to work, and then when you got old and sick, they took care of you. Nowadays, you have a big family, and it completely impoverishes you. Each kid costs a couple of $100,000, and you would only do it for the satisfaction that it delivers to you, right? Well, if somehow public policy could make children less a luxury consumption item, less of a financial burden on parents, maybe people would have more kids. Especially since Tucker Carlson points this out a lot. That, whenever people are asked in a survey, how many would you like to have, and their age X, they always give a number higher than they end up actually having. And when asked why didn't you? It's always, well, I got married later than I thought. It took forever to save up to buy a house. And then we had to get into this school district, and we had to do this and blah, blah, blah. And, some of the pressure on them is economic. I'm sure that the civilizational factors outweigh the economic factors, but the economic factors are the ones that politicians could actually do something to mitigate, if not fix. And, I was just at an event Tuesday, Claremont Institute event. J.D. Vance was the speaker. He's going to run for Senate in Ohio. And he started out, he said, I have a very simple vision. I don't remember his exact words, but it was something like that we need to have a country in which the middle class can afford to get married and raise children on one income. That's my vision. Like, all right. He didn't give me the 5-point plan as to exactly how he was going to do that as one senator under the grip of Mitch McConnell and his own caucus and Chuck Schumer running the Senate. On the other hand, the vision seems to me to be the right one. And the more politicians we have thinking like that, talking like that, hopefully that means eventually the more we will have who are actually willing to act on that and do something about it.
The one income is crucial, and that has to mean one income in a 2-person family. No, I mean, it doesn't help a lot to have.
Oh no, that's clearly what he meant.
Broken families.
Although,
I will. I need to watch that Vance speech. I've been sent links of it, and I need to watch it. I've seen a couple of clips. I will say that Vance did himself a favor by growing a beard. He looks very good with a beard. So I think he looked very baby faced without the beard. I know Cruz grew a beard and so on. So maybe that's the coming thing. I just glancing at him, I thought he looked good in a beard.
Well,
so
it just like I said, if that's the direction the Republican and boy did people. I mean, I was there for the whole speech. He said nothing that I thought was in the least bit immoderate, and yet people really freaked out. I mean, the amount of attacks that he received for that, and the Claremont Institute, it threatened somebody.
Attack for a sign of virtue. And
this idea that, well, wait a minute, one income? I mean, why is that the thing?
You saw that the Republican National Committee was tweeting out how terrible it is that women have been unable to work, and they need to get, because of COVID, and they need to get back out and work, because that's what the Republican Party is all about, women working. So, and that's why the Republican Party is just a pile of crap. So this brings up my second point, though, or it obliquely brings up my second point, which is I got a call from another friend of mine who religiously listens to Claremont podcasts and also religiously reads The Worthy House. He is, however, a big firm lawyer, and he is not. He used to be liberal by 1990 standards and has moved to kind of centrist. And of course, centrist in a big firm lawyer is right wing by big law firm standards. But he, for example, is a great admirer of, David French. And so I know that that causes you pain. So he likes to read National Review. Now I
more feel bad for the guy.
No, he's a great guy. So I think there are a lot of people like this, or at least some people like this, who listen to the Claremont podcast and so on, because Claremont is the coming thing, and all roads lead to Claremont. So he enjoys these things, and we talk about these things, and I actually find a lot of what he says to be very valuable. But his specific point was not that I should think more highly of them, but that if our goal, our aim is to pull people like him more in our direction, being mean to people who are generally within the same sphere as we are, at least perceived by the left that way. That is, I don't think the average person out there, if presented Michael Anton and David French, if he has just gotten back from his local BLM march, is going to draw a lot of daylight between the two of you. So to your average person off the street, it seems like, famously emigre communities, say Eastern European, Central European emigres, fought a lot among each other under communism. They had no power, and so they spent all their time fighting each other. So is it a mistake for us to be mean to David French? That's my question.
Good question. I would say, having been mean to David French and intending to be mean to David French again, I'm tempted to say no. But I want to admit the fact that your friend may have a point. If I were able to speak to him directly, I would say, look, you Charles's friend, lawyer man, misunderstand fundamentally what French is and what he does. Right? His real his modus operandi is to constantly attack me, my institutions, the things I care about, the issues I care about in the back, and give aid and comfort to my enemies. So you are over-interpreting or over-reading or being over-generous whenever he says something that sounds vaguely conservative. And you're either not seeing or you're downplaying all the tremendous damage that he does in league with people who are trying to wreck everything that I care about. Leave aside all the ways that David French is awful to people like me personally and my institutions personally. It's the effects that he's having on the surrounding society and the surrounding institutions that are devastatingly bad. He really is just an enemy collaborator, which means functionally he's no different from an enemy. I frankly don't even really believe him when he says that he's still conservative on X and Y and Z, right? But even if I were to concede that across the board, okay, everything French says he's conservative about, he really is, and he's telling the truth. None of it outweighs the damage he does. So, on all the things that we were just talking about, David French is either not on our side explicitly, or or if he pretends to be explicitly, in every effective action that he takes it to undermine our side, right? So he's horribly against, I think he's tweeted some really super nasty. Actually, Vance brought him up in the speech. That's correct. That's right. About
I didn't see that.
Some attack that French had made on him recently. It's like, so David, why don't you explain to me, Mr. Christian conservative, what's so horrible about the vision of a middle-class family on one income being able to lead a middle-class life, raise children to a middle-class standard of living, and send them out into the world with productive lives? Why are you attacking that guy? And French will come up with some guilt by association, triple bank shot. Well, this person said this once, and this is odious, and he's nothing but a kind of gatekeeper, a policeman for the right, and really what I think he and people like him tend to do is react histrionically to jaywalking on the right, while they either excuse or ignore mass murder by the left.
Yes, as you know, I am obsessed. That's really not too strong a word, with this tendency on the right to police the boundaries of the right excessively. And I think that's a terrible thing. And I think obviously people like David French are complicit in that. But yeah, and I agree certainly with your analysis of David French. And David French has never called me any names because he doesn't know who I am. Though maybe if he hears about this podcast, he'll put me on his enemies.
Your profile is rising, so your time will
That's
come.
awesome. I feel good about that. So to your average, let's say again, trying to think about the average person on the street who used to be all generally in favor of the left, but is turned off by burn, loot, murder, riots, and what have you. And so he's looking into the right ecosystem, and he sees David French, who talks a lot about he's a Christian and he served in Iraq, even if it was behind a desk. And I didn't serve in Iraq, so just kind of off the cuff, David French looks like he's a more based He-Man than I am. So maybe David French should be listened to. So I don't disagree with anything you're saying. I'm just saying that to someone who listens to our talk about French being an enemy collaborator, and that doesn't resonate with them. And so in David French actually I understand this is bizarre, but David French is appealing to that person. That is, that person finds David French appealing. I understand that seems like a null set category, but there are people out there who really find David French appealing. So what should our way to reach those people be? I agree with your analysis, but pointing out the evil that David French does is only going to be effective with a minority of those people.
Well, look, one could spend a lot of time reading him, which I don't, and critiquing him, which I don't, because it is.
I don't read you. I don't read him either.
It's a waste of time. Now, I've done it in the past. In fact, I don't know. It's got to be close to 2 years ago now. I wrote a really long piece for the American Mind called Vichy Cons, conservative collaborators, and it was
everyone should go find that piece.
It was mostly about him, and it was one of the few times where I really went through, engaged, and read what he had said and others like him had said. I'm not going to spend that much time on it. At the end of the day, that if we have to convince people without demonstrating to them what the guy really is, like they're never going to accept that. I guess my sad conclusion is I don't think such people are ever really going to be with us. Right?
Yeah, that's possible.
If you don't know at this point what Bill Kristol is, and what Jonah Goldberg is, and what David French is, then you have two options. One is you got to just dig in and read it and find out and read the rebuttals and see which side you come down on, right? Or not, and try to straddle both worlds. But if you're going to do the latter, then many of the things that I write are probably going to offend you, and you're going to think that it's all my fault. And I don't know what I could say to you. So, for instance, in a piece that I did read, because I was paid to read it, Law and Liberty had something up by Jay Nordlinger, a sort of David French type, at National Review, in which Nordlinger talked about the Weather Underground bombing of a Greenwich Village townhouse in 1970. And Nordlinger basically summed up, and this is a people building a bomb to go and bomb a U.S. Army dance of a bunch of young enlisted soldiers in the middle of the Vietnam War and their dates. So we're talking like 19 or 20-year-old girls from the surrounding neighborhood. And they were going to kill them. And because they were idiots, they blew the bomb up while they were building it in one of their parents' townhouses on Washington Square. And I think 6 of them died. Mm-hmm. And Nordlinger goes on about how terrible this all was. And then his conclusion is, of course, to compare it to January 6th and say, well, we're all guilty. and then he goes back to Kristallnacht in order to say that, violence is just a part of, Kristallnacht. He has to cross the ocean and get in a time machine to somehow put this on the right. And I let him have it in the response that Law and Liberty asked me to write. Now, if you read those two pieces, Jay Nordlinger's and mine, and then Jay Nordlinger's defense of himself, to which I wrote some response, but I never published it, and you can't see that there's just a divide here that is, as far as I can tell, unbridgeable in the current circumstances. There's not much I can do for you or am willing to do for you because I've put all of my energies and efforts into other directions.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I have to say, I don't know if this is the first time I heard of you, but I think it was probably the first time I heard of you by name was when Bill Kristol compared you to Carl Schmitt in some tweet. But he, of course, he had a Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, not just political theorist Carl Schmitt. And I had not read any Carl Schmitt at the time, and since then I've read some and intend to read more. And I think Carl Schmitt is fascinating. But the name calling has been going on for a long time. So I'm name calling a few. So I can certainly appreciate that you've had about enough, given that they're certainly not going to change their mind. I mean, that's another way of looking at it. David French is not progressing towards some kind of engagement with people farther to his right. He's doing the opposite. I mean, I totally agree. David French is indistinguishable politically from an enemy, but is more dangerous because he's an undeclared enemy. So I agree with that analysis. And
David French's whole business model is to pretend to be a conservative so that Time and the New York Times and the mainstream media who are declared enemies can use him and say, see, even the conservative David. It's Mickey Kaus used to make fun of this, where the New Republic had been drifting right for a long, long time. And the conservative media used to say, I love to say, even the liberal New Republic, like he said, this has become a ridiculous trope on behalf of the conservative media because, especially when it came to issues of war and peace, the New Republic was very, very hawkish and interventionist. So the idea that the liberal New Republic supports the conservative case for invading country X in 2004 was a joke. I mean, it was, of course they do, right? So, it's the same thing. It's the same exact business model. It's the same exact pose, just from ostensibly a different side of the aisle.
So what does David French think about masks?
I don't first of all, I don't think he's on National Review anymore. I think he moved over.
I think he left. He's the bulwark or one of those things that Ryan is.
Second of all, I don't even read National Review anymore. So I don't know what he thinks.
Well, I say that facetiously. I don't really care what David French thinks about masks. What I more mean is that we've seen in the past week, surprisingly, these mask mandates and, more importantly, these private mask mandates in stores and so on start to crumble. So, but I'm also obsessed. I guess I've been talking a bunch about my obsessions today, so maybe obsession isn't quite the right word. But
one point on the mask mandates, my wife went out today to the a local drugstore and returned. Thought that she saw a sign of great progress. It was a sign in the store that said "masks encouraged."
Yes, well, I mean sure. I mean that's not progress. I mean.
Well, no, it's progress here, around here in my little part of Blue America. That's progress. That means,
What I mean is that it's somewhat more than progress in the sense that it's the complete collapse of the mask mandates, because encouraged means nothing. It means that because if you're not required to do it, the people who weren't going to do it anyway aren't going to do it. And so encouraged is, you might as well say masked. I mean, it's the same kind of communicative quantum. And so, but what I've been fascinated by, and this is a subset of what I regard as the larger COVID hysteria, is around here, at least, the masks have essentially fallen apart in the same way as you say, either masks are encouraged or they're not required anywhere, really, or very, very rarely. How many people are still wearing masks? I find this entirely bizarre. That is, there's all these people out there who are vaccinated, and yet they're still wearing masks. Why is that?
I think it's a virtue signal. I mean, let me give you an example, which you probably have seen. It's got pretty widespread play. This kid, David Hogg, who became famous after a mass shooting and then went to Harvard and then tried to found a pillow company to beat Mike Lindell, then had to unfound the pillow company or something. I don't know. But he's just an internet celebrity with no real accomplishment at all. Tweeted, and like I said, people send me tweets. I look at the tweets I get sent mostly. This was one that was sent to me from several different quarters. So many of my friends thought it was important. And it was him saying, I understand that they've lifted the mask mandates and I'm vaccinated, but I'm still going to wear a mask outside because I don't want people to think I'm a conservative. So the answer, I think that answers your question. What does David French think about masks? As long as writing and tweeting about how masks are good and people who don't wear them are bad, he'll be for it.
I think
that's
that makes,
because that's what team he's on.
But there's two counterexamples. One is locally. I live in what's generally a red town, purplish maybe, and 80% of the people, 90% of the people at Target are still wearing masks. And I guarantee you that 90% of the people didn't vote for Joe Biden around here. So I just can't see that 90% of the people are into that level of virtue signaling. Of course, David Hogg, internet celebrity, who really should change his name if he wants any respect, it does that. But I just can't believe that that's universally the case. And supporting that is my other point, which I just cannot get over, that how universal the Wuhan plague hysteria is, even in places that, back to what we were just talking about, like Hungary. So I've been spending a bunch of time reading about Hungary because Rod Dreher is in Hungary, and I do read Rod Dreher, and I like Rod Dreher, though I have some reservations about him, as you know. And the hysteria is like over the top in Hungary. That for a year and a half they've had no dining at all, and not just no outdoor dining, no dining. They have a curfew. All these. At the same time, Dreher admits that the death rate in Hungary is the same as the death rate in Louisiana, where he's from, where I'm pretty sure that people in Louisiana are not, doing any of those things. And so, but they're still hysterical about it. And the Hungarians are, these are the same people who vote 70% for Viktor Orban because he's based and wants to stick it to Angela Merkel. I don't understand why these people do this. I mean, what is driving
the Hungarian case surprises me, and I don't know. I think in America, though, at the beginning of the plague, whatever we want to call it, it took a month, 6 weeks, 2 months max before everybody figured out, what side they were going to take for the battle lines to be formed. We didn't really know at the beginning, but we knew after 2 months max that masks were a blue thing and no masks or resistance to the lockdowns was a red thing. Because I think I count myself here as among them. When this started, I thought maybe this is real. These things do happen. This could be a once in 100 year event. And if it's real and we have to wear masks or we need to be locked down, like I'll do that. I'm not going to be, it takes a while for you to sort of filter through and realize, you just start processing the data points and you realize this is at best a grave exaggeration. To me, maybe the aha moment or the final straw was when Fauci was asked specifically about, he says, well, you can't shake hands. Basically, we should get rid of the practice of shaking hands, forever, for the rest of history. And then he was asked, what about Tinder hookups? He says, oh, that's fine. I thought, now we know, right? To me, he said that because because he's an idiot or because he's an ideologue, and none of these are mutually exclusive, by the way, or he knows what the only acceptable regime answer is, which is that Tinder and casual sex and hookupping are inviolable tenets of the regime and he cannot take them on. And so that Absolutely. Has to be okay.
Yeah, no, I had the exact same experience. I remember the first time I went to Costco, like three weeks in, they opened up Costco and we were running out of milk. And they were making people line up 10 feet apart outside and so on. So I went there and put on my mask and strapped on my handgun, illegal at Costco, but whatever. And so, because, you can never, and it was this totally creepy scene inside. It was like a scene from The Walking Dead, only better lit, like all these people scurrying around, staying 30 feet. But you're right. Eventually it became, I have literally spent zero time worrying about the Wuhan plague personally or for anybody associated with me since August, maybe July. It takes up zero mind space other than as a political matter. And I go out and here, the restaurants are all open and they have the silly thing where you expected to put it on when you check in and then everyone takes them off. It's just stupid, but I don't spend any time worrying about it. But out there are just all these people, and even here, who spend hours, as far as I can tell, a day obsessively worrying about it. I guess my concern is that this is a sign. Concern isn't right. It's just confirmatory that we have no resiliency as a society, and that the next something that comes along that actually is a big problem is going to knock everything over, which is fine by me at some level because I want everything knocked over. But really, it's just kind of a clown show.
I have a hypothesis, which is maybe a bit too white pill, but I'll share it anyway.
You have white pills?
That is to say, I think some of the mask stuff is the reaction of a society that kind of lost all shared sense of purpose and community and togetherness, and that to a lot of people, wearing the mask, it's a sign that like you're committed to helping your fellows, that they see you without it, they think you're being selfish and you don't care that you might spread it and you might harm the community. Whereas, a real community, like, the kind of thing our parents or grandparents grew up in, where people actually did know each other, care about each other, and support each other, wouldn't need these dumb rituals. So I'm partly to blame for this, in the sense that we've bounced around a lot, moved to a lot of different places, haven't gotten to know any of our neighbors, and partly because we move around too much, partly because society is different today than it was. The street I grew up on, I knew everybody on the block, absolutely every house on the block. I knew who they were. I knew them by name. Some of them were very old people who didn't have kids. Many of them had kids my age, and so on. I knew them all, and we're not like that anymore. And maybe people are just grasping, because I do hear the moral edge when people see an unmasked person and they get upset. Some of that's hectoring and it's scolding, and some of it's fear. I might catch the virus, but I think some of it is somehow they think you're letting down the team. You're letting down the tribe, and they don't have a tribe. And so mask versus no mask is like the first instance of feeling togetherness with their fellow communities that they've felt maybe in their whole lives. I don't even call that a theory. It doesn't rise to the level of a theory. It's a hypothesis.
I actually think there's a lot of truth in that. I think it's silly, in part because the nature of masks is they simultaneously hugely increase social corrosion, simply because humans are attuned to other people's faces, and not being able to see expressions is extremely damaging. I will say that yesterday, my wife and I went to Home Depot to buy garden stuff for planting the garden. And a couple of days ago, Home Depot quit requiring masks. There's no sign at all about masks, encouraged or not. About 50% of the people were still wearing masks, maybe 60%. Every man over 40, no mask. Every young man, mask. Most of the women, masked. Not all the women. But many of the employees were not masked, or maybe 30% of the employees were not masked. But the fascinating thing wasn't any of that. It was the atmosphere of kind of joy. You saw all these people, and we participated in this, talking to each other. Normally, you just kind of scurry around and you get your stuff, and maybe you nod at someone or say, "Excuse me." People were stopping to have conversations, and cross racial boundaries. I think probably part of it is that a lot of people are tired of the kind of racial division that's pushed, and so everyone was stopping to talk to everybody, and not just the people without masks, but largely the people without masks. I actually thought, speaking of white pills, it was a very hopeful sign. I don't have any hope for this society, but it gave me hope that it's easier than perhaps one might expect to reconstitute a better society, simply because the way people are reacting to this kind of relief. Now, maybe it's temporary. We saw this after 9/11 too. There was famously people were packing the churches and talking to each other, and 2 weeks later they were back shoplifting and taking stuff out of people's backpacks or whatever they do in New York. But somewhere in there's the common humanity that makes it possible to run a decent society. We just need to defenestrate the federal government first, and then everyone can be happy. But I was actually quite happy. So I came home and drank a bunch of beer and looked out over the spring landscape and felt good about myself. So I always feel good about myself, but I felt extra good about myself. So anyway, that's my COVID thoughts. Do you have any other COVID thoughts for me?
No, I guess not.
I would have thought you would have all sorts of COVID thoughts. Does it not take up a lot of your mind space?
It doesn't. The more what takes up what I'm preoccupied by is the ease with which the government was able to impose these restrictions illegally or extra legally or unconstitutionally or anti-constitutionally. The ease with which people accepted them. I think that was this. I like to say, or I like to believe that America is a country founded in a revolution, and therefore there's a revolutionary spirit. Well, people with a sufficient revolutionary spirit would have demanded more evidence, or at least demanded that lawful procedures be followed before they accepted conduct like this. And wouldn't have just accepted decrees and started going along. That's a bit disturbing. Now,
is your conclusion that the moral fiber or political fiber of the people has just decayed, or is there some other reason?
Well, they're definitely decayed. I don't know how much. If you can get people to believe that, that they might die, or, people also feel guilty. It's like you could kill your own grandmother if you don't wear a mask. And do you want to be responsible for old ladies' deaths? That message is powerful.
As I told my elderly aunt the other day, if a 87-year-old dies at 87 rather than 88 because of COVID, that's not a tragedy. She didn't really necessarily like that, I don't think. She's only 83. She has 4 years to go. What's she complaining about?
Yeah.
But I was thinking, apropos of this, do you remember in 2004 when the entire Democratic presidential campaign was centered around how Republicans were denying us the wonderful benefits of stem cells?
Yes.
And I finally realized why there was this obsession with stem cells around that time, which of course have turned out to be a complete and total bust, at least so far. I realized it was because it was right around that time that the baby boomers, who are the worst generation in human history — everyone should read Helen Andrews' book on boomers, and my review of it, which is also quite good — were hoping that they were starting to feel their mortality, in my opinion, and they thought that stem cells were going to make them live forever, because they had all these people running around that stem cells were going to save us. Ray Kurzweil was telling us that we would upload all our brains, we're all going to be immortal, and so on. And now it's all gone away. And so maybe what's coming, you see in these mask things, is kind of the echoes of this. That is this feeling that we all need to live forever, that we all need to get some extra time, driven largely by the mortality of this selfish and self-centered generation. And maybe younger people put up with it simply because the costs don't seem that huge. The government's handing out money, they get to stay home, wearing a mask. It may be degrading, but at least it's not hugely damaging or painful. So maybe it's just for a lot of people, they feel that the benefits may be fake, but the costs aren't that high. And then there's some set of people who think it will help them live forever.
I think for some people, the benefits were very real. And that is to say, I should have spotted this earlier and I didn't, but it's now obvious in hindsight that one of the drivers of the blue-red divide over masks and lockdowns is that blues can telecommute much more easily than reds. And what's not to like if you're, about an extended period where you don't have to go commute, you don't have to go to work, you don't have to go to the office, you don't have to do this, and you don't have to do that. If you're a knowledge worker, I mean, I could put knowledge in air quotes, but if you're some form of non-physical laborer, somebody whose job doesn't require being on a site or moving around, right?
Yeah.
Your convenience is gone straight up. Or it's Homer Simpson put it in an episode where he goes on disability so that he can stay home and work by a computer. He gets one of those little birds whose beaks dip down into, and he has to push a key every once in a while. Oh no, that's not what it was. Before that, he realized he keeps getting these questions and he keeps going, yes. He writes yes. He writes yes. And then he begins to type it another time, but he's slow. And he realizes that just the why solves his problem. And he says to Marge, while you've been grouching at me, I just tripled my productivity. I think a lot of these people feel like this, right? And the teachers especially. Now, I think there are some teachers who realized that the virtual school was a total disaster and they miss being around the kids. But a lot of them probably thought, it's absolutely outstanding. I don't have to go anywhere or do anything anymore. So many, I mean, to this day, it's now, what are we? We're well into
14
months into this. DC traffic, which was abysmal the entire time I lived here, has not even close to return to normal. So, which I'm quite okay with as somebody who has to drive into the office for about 20 miles every couple of times a week. It used to take quite a bit longer than it does now. I think there are a lot, not just, it wasn't just the money and the checks and stuff like that. I think that this still getting paid and not having to go, like if you're a house painter or something like that, A, you have to go there, and B, when they say, well, you can't go anywhere, it means you can't work and you can't make money.
Uh-huh.
If you're an editor or, any one of these BS jobs types things, as long as the company doesn't go under, you still get paid, you still do your job, and you're saving money because you don't have to commute, you're saving wear and tear, you're saving inconvenience. And I think a lot of people loved it, and they thought it was a quote unquote staycation. I
think it's fully exposed, as you say, that the reality that a great many of these knowledge type jobs are BS jobs. So which actually, in some ways, I think is good in the sense that I think if it makes me believe that in an economic downturn, the reduction in actual output won't, if there's a bunch of jobs are lost, will not be significant. Of course, the unemployment is its own set of problems, and the government printing money and so on. It also exposed, and this is not original to me, but I have personal experience with it, the not just the inadequate job of a lot of teaching, but the propaganda of a lot of teaching. We pulled out our children out of the private school that they're in, which has now been completely ruined by wokeism. But this was over a year ago. And we realized, and they were doing Zoom instruction with actual teachers. I think my understanding is some schools don't do actual Zoom instruction with live teachers, but rather log in and download your assignments type instruction. But we have second graders and third graders, and among other children, because we have a bunch of children, unlike all the other people we were talking about, and they were indoctrinating, and this is supposedly a non-political excellent school. And the classic example is talking about heroes. Now, all the heroes were based upon identity politics, and they had to write these are second graders, a section about why this woman, Bessie Coleman, was a hero. And I never heard of Bessie Coleman. So I looked her up, and she was a biracial Black Indian flyer of the 1920s who accomplished nothing at all and didn't put her seatbelt on and fell out of her plane. But in 1927, and so no one has ever heard of her between 1927 and about 2016. But now I looked into it. She's this huge bandwagon of Bessie Coleman, obviously because she's Black, and I typed in for the children about why Bessie Coleman was not a hero, and that a hero is someone who takes risks to benefit others. And Bessie Coleman may or may not have been a very nice person, but she was irrelevant to history and all accomplishment. And the little children got a 0 on the assignment. So which I had written for them. So we pulled them out of school. But I mean, and now they read books from the 1950s that I got about real heroes. And so that I solved that problem. But somewhere out there, all those other children are having real heroes substituted by losers like Bessie Coleman. It's just appalling. But at least this Zoom education has exposed that for the parents who are paying attention. And are willing to take action.
It's a good segue to something that's been on my mind for a while, and I haven't figured out a way to address this yet. I probably have to talk about it somewhat carefully, but I'll try to make it relevant, and without couching what I have to say too much. So I teach at Hillsdale College, so famously a conservative school. It's not, despite what a lot of people think, a right-wing indoctrination camp. But also, it's not one of those things where there was a time before the academy purged its last vestige of conservatism, that if something like 5% of the faculty were right of center, the place had a reputation as a conservative school. It's not like that. I mean, it's more than 5%. But you learn real stuff. It's not woke garbage. The curriculum is rigorous and it's sound, and it's a lot of classics, that kind of the stuff that I teach, a lot of Greek books, a lot of medieval, modern stuff, and also 20th century, but none of the wokey garbage. Mm-hmm. And I feel it's much even though it's an ostensibly conservative school, I feel it's much closer to the education that I got from a public university 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. Than certainly anything you could get in any mainstream college, public or private today. That's just how far education has come. The kind of books that I'm assigning are the kinds of books that I read in college 30 years ago, that a public university, which was openly liberal, had no problem assigning in those days.
Where did you go undergrad?
Berkeley.
Oh, wow. Turned out well. I'm impressed.
I'm a California native, and it was, let me just put it this way, it was different in those days.
Yeah.
Different in those days. So one of the things that I worry about or wonder about is, on the one hand, we're doing these kids a great service. And if I were going off to college today, I'd want to go to Hillsdale or a place like Hillsdale. On the other hand, how well are we preparing them to operate in this new world? That is to say, one advantage that you do get from going to, a big city, well, not a big city public high school, but let's say a big time private high school, or one of the public high schools of the blue suburbs that ring American cities and that are the home of the professional, that sort of second tier of the ruling class that's not particularly rich, but that makes good salaried incomes and can afford in New York to move to, Scarsdale or Montclair, New Jersey or whatever, or in Virginia, Montgomery or Fairfax County or something like that. Those kids will be steeped in the ruling class ideology. They will know how the ruling class thinks. They will sort of know what can be said and what cannot be said. And I wonder about, this is a completely different question than the socialization question, which you get a lot. Like, well, if you homeschool, you can teach your kids all of this stuff, but won't they grow up to be strange because they're not around peers all the time and they don't do this? We've been hearing that debate for 20 years. I'm more asking is, if we teach them a bunch of true material, valuable material, as if it were 1990 or 1950, and then they try to go out and function in the world and it's 2025 or 2030, how well are they going to do? And how well are they going to be able to navigate that? Are they, or is there a danger that they will simply be seen by peers and by the management layers 1 and 2 levels above them through whom they have to make their careers as not merely, freaks, although there'll probably be some of that, but even as kind of these hostile entities? And how do we deal with them?
Well, I can speak for myself, and for myself, we're placing a bet. By we, I mean, I and my wife, which is that future doesn't exist, or rather, that is to say, the future where our children are subordinated to upper level managers as they attempt to climb the ladder of the professional manager league does not exist for one of 2 reasons. Either because that entire future has imploded, which is certainly my preferred future, and a new future has arisen, or they're not on that track. They've taken a trade track, or they're doing independent computer work, or they're doing something like that doesn't. We just affirmatively reject and refuse to do anything that will put our children on the same track that I went on. I mean, I went through that whole track. I mean, I originally was going to be a doctor. I was a biochemistry major, and because I greatly admire my grandfather, who was a doctor, and I did well at chemistry. But then I realized I didn't really want to help other people. And you have to put in so much work as a doctor that I went to law school and took a different track. But it was very much a professional managerial elite track. And I just don't want my children to do that because, as you say, they'll be behind the 8 ball because of the way they've been raised. So either they'll stay behind the 8 ball or they'll suffer as a result, neither of which outcomes is good, or they'll just be distorted by the whole global homo thing. And we just reject that entirely. It's not Amish, but we're placing a bet that they can live their lives successfully without having to get on the same path that we stepped off of. We stepped off of it for other reasons, but hopefully they can do that.
I feel this acutely, especially at least a few times a semester. A student will ask for office hours and come and say, I really enjoy the stories that you tell in class about your time in government or your time in the corporate world doing X or Y or Z. And I want to do that. And how do I get into it? And I think on the one hand, I don't want to be discouraging. And on the other hand, I would be doing a disservice if I lied to them. So I try to split it down the middle. That is to say, all right, well, you can't really copy my career because it had no plan and so on. But if I were you today, I would be looking at these things. But then I also try to give them a warning and say, look, these institutions aren't the way they were when I went into the National Security Council for the first time. It was 2001. The national security bureaucracy was a completely different place then. I went back in 2017, and while I did okay, right, it was a lot different and a lot worse. And it's going to be much worse by the time much different, much more hostile to the things that your parents raised you to care about and that you learned from us and that you presumably care about. And, I'm not trying to tell you don't do this or whatever. I'm just saying, if you do want to do it, you need to go in knowing what you're getting into and knowing that it may not turn out the way that you'd like to see.
But being hostile to reality is being much worse. I mean, the national security apparatus and the military apparatus is much worse. Yeah. I assume you see, I know back to current events, I assume you did see some of the CIA video and the Army recruiting video that came out in the past week or 10 days. I mean, it's a clown show. And, I had some back and forth on Twitter. Again, I'm not a big back and forth on Twitter. Some people were saying, well, you can still run a competent army and intelligence apparatus with people like this because there have been subordinate armies made up of subordinate classes throughout history that have been quite successful. But I can assure you that tranny soldiers raised by 2 moms or whatever it is do not compare to the Mamluks. These 2 things are not the same kind of subordinated military. And so No, I mean, why would anyone go into the intelligence apparatus or the national security apparatus now? I just can't see why you would.
Well, some of it is, I think, that just a sort of out of date sense of what these things are like. That I want to serve my country, and they don't understand the extent to which, and it's hard to explain it to them without sounding cynical and discouraging. But then again, as I say, I don't want to lie, but it's hard to explain to them the extent to which these agencies now, or these organizations, really serve the regime and not the country anymore.
But it's kind of obvious if they just look around. I mean, as far as I can tell, the primary role of the U.S. military is to force countries that are insufficiently compliant to fly the rainbow flag on every holiday. It's kind of obvious. It's not like they're making a secret of it. You'd think any young person would see this, or maybe the young people are all corrupted to a degree that I don't appreciate.
No, I don't think that's true. I mean, I certainly, when I talk about students, I know there are a lot of students who pretty clearly see what's going on. But then there's a lot who either don't, or they're kind of halfway there. Anyway, it's just it's not something I have yet figured out. But
if your students don't take that track, what track? And they can't really take a track like yours, because it's unique, obviously, and has many interesting things, but it's not, and they can't really take an academic track. What tracks are left open?
I mean, Hillsdale, being a conservative and very patriotic school, it sends a lot of kids into the military. A lot of them go on to officer candidate school or so on. Well, that in itself in 2021, given especially look at what they're doing to the Pentagon right now, right? I mean, it's one thing to join up and become a Marine officer in 1984. But now you're not joining the same organization with the same ethos at the top, with the same kind of sense of purpose from upper management or from the officer corps. It's different. And without pouring too much cold water on their dreams, I just want them all to go in. I think, look, a lot of them have their eyes fully open, and those are the ones that don't need to come to me and ask about it. Or if I end up seeing them and meeting them at events, I can figure out pretty quickly, yeah, they get it. It's, but Hillsdale kids are not, they're growing up, not all of them, but a lot of them are growing up in, the parts of the country that, let's say, you're probably more familiar with than I am, right? I spent all my time bouncing around Blue America, and I always have. And now I get students who are from, suburbs of medium-sized cities or from very rural areas and so on. And yeah, of course, everybody can watch the news and read the paper, but if you don't grow up steeped in Blue America, you may not really know just how blue America can get, and you may have an outdated impression of what America is like still.
Don't the students who are going to the military face the exact same problem that you outlined earlier with respect to being in the professional managerial elite, which is particularly since the electoral justice protest, as I like to call it, on January 6th?
Yeah,
the left is using that as a way of exterminating and rooting out wrongthink within the military. And so these children, they're adults, obviously, these adults, young adults who are now going into the military will face basically a bunch of commissars constantly monitoring their behavior, not just on duty, but off duty, social media, what have you. That's in some ways worse than having a professional managerial elite manager grade C4 reviewing you, because that person is less incentivized to bother you outside of work hours than the military is.
Yeah, I think that's very likely true. And that's something I will tell them. Like, if you don't realize this, then you need to be careful when you get in there. I can remember I had a ball in college, being, along with a bunch of friends, being the kind of right-wing provocateurs on campus. We would print things and say things, and we didn't pay any kind of a price for that. We really didn't. We didn't get worse grades. I was saying this to somebody else, and a guy who went to Berkeley about 20 years before I did, that even as late as the late 80s, early 90s, I could be openly conservative. I could argue with my professors. I could write papers that from a right-wing perspective, and the papers were graded based on quality. Like, I never felt like I got some grades that I wasn't particularly proud of. I never felt like I got a bad grade because I took them on. The way the experience, like you described, getting a 0 for saying, like, that never happened to me.
As a second grader.
Yeah, as a second grader. That never happened to me. So I say to them, like, if you do go into this, you're going to need to be somewhat careful, right? You can't just don't be that guy at the Space Force who took on cult Marxism and he lost his job the same day.
I did buy his book, though, which was #1 on Amazon for a while.
It was?
Well,
okay.
Yet,
Well, maybe that'll all work out for him. But the point is, if you want to stay in the force. And I also wonder to what extent, when they say they're going to track and root out extremism, well, what do they base it on? I mean, to some extent, they're just going to start looking at people's backgrounds and going, if you're from this certain place and you went to these certain schools, you probably think like X and therefore you're a problem.
Sure.
You have a stigma on you.
You're a kulak, it's a class indicia of taken as an indicator of political belief. So, but I don't mind that in the sense that I think it's good to bring down the regime, but it's bad for the people who are going into it.
Right. That's my point. I mean, I would do that that is to say, I would just start looking at where did you go to college as a proxy for, are you likely to be, ideologically an outlier from us? I would do that if I were them. That is to say, if I were running the regime. So I have to assume that they are doing that.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I don't, not that close to anyone in the military, so I don't know the specifics, but my guess is there'll be eventually exposés and this kind of stuff. It's also possible that it'll be administered totally incompetently. So, for example, if you rely on the people like that CIA woman who was in that advertising video talking about her generalized anxiety disorder, maybe she'll be so anxious she won't be able to actually get anything done in terms of evaluating potential, so-called extremists, and nothing will actually happen. That's obviously very common in large sclerotic organizations. So maybe it's. I mean, this goes back to your earlier point about there haven't been successful. They, meaning Biden and the left, have not been successful in doing anything dramatic in the past 5 months. Maybe they will be, but you'd think they would get out of the gate faster. I mean, they can't even get, there's several things that none spring to mind right now, but that they can't actually get pull over the finish line. Now, they're probably just waiting for some crisis or emergency they can use to whip stuff up. But the old playbook of finding, as they do with mass shootings, for example, of finding something that's emotionally wrenching and then using that to ram action through, it decays in a time when more than half the people look at what the media says and assume it's a lie. So you get diminishing returns on that strategy, and that makes it harder to ram through things in a divided country, which is good.
On the question of incompetence, though, when the same person who said, "Hey, have you seen this attack in New York today?" I said, "No, I didn't see it." And then I searched for it. I tried to see if I could find something on it. I found nothing. I literally found nothing. Somebody had to send. It's the same thing when the media doesn't want you to find out about something. You find out because somebody goes out with a handheld phone and puts it up on Twitter and that kind of thing, and then it gets around that way. And I said,
off Twitter.
I said, on the one hand, it's impressive the degree to which they're able, in a sick way, it's impressive the degree to which the media is able to completely black this out, right? On the other hand, it's a little depressing. It shows that they're not quite as incompetent as I hoped or feared. But maybe that's.
But you heard about it, right?
I did.
I heard about it, and so neither of us is particularly, and certainly, I think this stuff spreads around even with attempts at censorship because stuff does route around this kind of damage. I don't know if you tried this, but I do any kind of search like that, both on Google and on DuckDuckGo, which uses Bing as a backend, because it's ever increasingly evident how Google manually censors results on any politically sensitive topic. So if you're searching, you might want to try an alternate search engine for new, because new stuff will come up more effectively that way.
But it's still look. Think about the effort that they have to put in to blackout news blackouts like this on a routine basis. And
I think it actually is easier than you would think. I'm hardly an expert in it. In fact, I know nothing about it. But just thinking about it out loud, it's fairly easy, because if you have a group of people whose only job is to look for trends, so you look at everything that is rising rapidly in dissemination, make an immediate judgment about whether you want that topic to be allowed to disseminate, and cut it off at the knees. Because at any given moment, given the bandwidth that people have, only a relatively small number of topics will be rapidly increasing in attention, and it's easy to pick those out algorithmically. So it's not that surprising that they can manually deal with news. It's harder to deal with manually with topics that are not news, but I can see how news is pretty easy to deal with.
Well, we'll have to wait for the incompetence to show itself in other places, in other realms, I suppose.
I can hardly wait. Well, my prediction is the printing money will catch up with us, and eventually people will realize that you can't fund 30% of the population off of fake money indefinitely. So we'll see what this year brings economically. But smart money says it's not going to be. It may not be dreadful, but it's not going to be good.
Is it time to put it all into crypto? Is that what maybe?
I know nothing about crypto, and I did see that crypto took a dump this week. I mean, I do know some people who are big into crypto, and I like the idea of crypto being cross-border portable. So when it's necessary to cross borders, it evades other capital controls. But I'm not going to buy any crypto because I don't understand it. And
I don't understand it. That's the biggest problem I have. Is I
bought a book on it, but I haven't read it. And it's just too volatile for me. I'm the kind of guy who's I'll buy it and then I'll drop by half and then I'll be angry. And
so what do you put it on a thumb drive, and then if you lose the thumb drive, your life savings is over?
There's different ways. There's hardware keys like a thumb drive where but you can also do keys that are simply a alphanumeric string, which you can also lose, or you can also do a phrase. So, for example, some people use the first line of some poem they know, so they can always recover that, right? If you pick some Tennyson poem, you can always find out what Tennyson said. But no one else is likely to guess that particular combination. So I think there's ways for people who pay attention to maintain security. I think most of the people who lose their money in Bitcoin or what have you are people who got it early, didn't really pay attention to it, didn't take necessary precautions, or just people who are clueless.
So since there's only 21 million ever Bitcoin, if you got one a long time and you lost it, is it just out there and unclaimed and unused by anyone, or does it?
I believe so. I think it's just floating out there in the ether. It's like Plato's forms or something. It's never going to be actually seen by humans again.
I'm going to be one of those poor suckers who just remains invested normally until it all collapses, and then I see my net worth zero out one day.
Well,
because I don't know what else to do.
You should buy gold and guns, but we'll save guns as a topic for another time.
All right. I think that was a fine place to end it. And with that, I am handing it back to Ryan Williams.
Thank you for listening to The Stakes, and thank you, Mike. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and our new Washington Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. And thank you all for listening.